When I heard about a subsea drone successfully targeting a Russian submarine, I realized we just witnessed the end of underwater warfare as we've known it for the past century. This isn't about one tactical success or one weapons system. This is about the moment when the ocean's three-dimensional geography stopped providing the protection that submarine warfare has always depended on. We've just entered an era where the seafloor is as transparent as the surface, and the strategic implications are going to reshape every Navy's calculations about power projection and maritime security. Let me explain why this single incident represents a fundamental shift in how geography determines naval power, and why the Russians are about to lose their primary tool for challenging Western maritime dominance. Submarine warfare has always been about exploiting the ocean's opacity, water blocks most forms of electromagnetic radiation, limits acoustic detection ranges, and creates a three-dimensional environment where submarines can hide by going deeper, changing course, or positioning themselves in acoustic shadows created by underwater terrain features. For over a century, submarines have been the great equalizer in naval warfare. A smaller, technologically inferior navy could threaten much larger surface fleets by deploying submarines that were nearly impossible to track and destroy once they submerged. The ocean's geography provided natural camouflage that made submarine detection extremely difficult and submarine destruction even harder. That geographic advantage just disappeared. Subsea drones represent a completely different approach to underwater warfare. Instead of trying to find submarines from the surface using sonar systems that are limited by acoustic physics and water conditions, these drones operate in the same three-dimensional environment as submarines. They can loiter underwater for extended periods, use multiple detection methods simultaneously, and coordinate with other drones to create detection networks that submarines can't avoid or outrun. More importantly, they can operate in areas where surface ships can't go, and at depths where traditional anti-submarine warfare becomes impossible. Russian submarines have always relied on hiding in deep water, under ice caps, or near underwater terrain features that complicate acoustic detection. Subsea drones don't care about any of those traditional hiding spots. The Russian Navy is particularly vulnerable to this technological shift because their submarine strategy has always been based on geographic advantages that no longer apply. Russian submarines operate from bases in the Arctic, the Baltic, and the Black Sea, enclosed or semi-enclosed bodies of water where traditional surface anti-submarine warfare is difficult, but where subsea drones can establish persistent surveillance networks. The Arctic, in particular, has been Russia's submarine sanctuary. Under the polar ice cap, Russian submarines could operate with near-complete impunity because surface ships couldn't follow them and aircraft-based detection systems couldn't penetrate the ice. But subsea drones can operate under ice for months at a time, creating detection networks that turn the Arctic Ocean from a Russian sanctuary into a transparent battlefield. The Baltic and Black Seas present even worse problems for Russian submarine operations. These are relatively small, enclosed bodies of water where subsea drone networks can provide complete coverage. Russian submarines operating in either of these seas would be constantly tracked and vulnerable to attack from weapon systems they can't detect or evade. This technological shift eliminates the geographic advantages that have made Russian submarine forces relevant despite their smaller numbers and aging equipment. Russian naval strategy has always been about using submarines to threaten NATO maritime supply lines while avoiding direct confrontation with superior NATO surface fleets. If submarines can't hide, that strategy becomes suicidal rather than merely dangerous. The broader implications for maritime security are enormous. Submarine-based nuclear deterrence depends on the ability to hide ballistic missile submarines in ocean areas where they can't be tracked or targeted by enemy forces. If subsea drones can provide persistent tracking of submarine movements, the survivability of sea-based nuclear forces becomes questionable. Russia operates several classes of ballistic missile submarines that form a crucial part of their nuclear deterrent. These submarines patrol areas of the Arctic and North Atlantic where they can reach targets in North America and Europe with submarine-launched ballistic missiles. The entire concept depends on these submarines being undetectable while on patrol. Subsea drone networks change that calculation completely. Instead of trying to find and track individual submarines using expensive and limited surface assets, Western navies could deploy persistent underwater surveillance networks that monitor all submarine movements in critical ocean areas. Russian ballistic missile submarines would lose their primary strategic advantage, invisibility. The economic implications are equally dramatic. Building and maintaining submarine fleets requires enormous investments in specialized shipyards, technical expertise, and support infrastructure. If submarines become easily detectable and vulnerable to attack, those investments become wasted resources rather than strategic assets. Russia has spent decades building submarine construction capabilities and training submarine crews while allowing their surface fleet to deteriorate. This made strategic sense when submarines provided asymmetric advantages against superior NATO naval forces. If those advantages disappear, Russia will have invested enormous resources in military capabilities that no longer serve any useful strategic purpose. The technological requirements for effective submarine operations are also becoming more complex and expensive. Modern submarines need advanced acoustic dampening, sophisticated electronic warfare capabilities, and integrated defense systems to operate in environments where they might be constantly tracked by hostile drones. Russia's submarine industrial base is already struggling to maintain their existing fleet and build new submarines with current-generation technology. Adding the additional complexity and cost required to operate effectively against subsea drone threats would strain Russian resources beyond their current capabilities. China faces similar challenges, but from a different geographic position. Chinese submarine strategy depends on controlling the waters near their coastline and threatening American naval forces operating in the Western Pacific. But the South China Sea, East China Sea, and Yellow Sea are all relatively shallow, enclosed bodies of water where subsea drone networks could provide comprehensive surveillance coverage. Chinese submarines operating in these areas would be constantly tracked and vulnerable to attack from weapons systems they can't avoid. Chinese anti-access, area denial strategies that depend on submarines threatening American aircraft carrier groups become much less viable if those submarines can't operate undetected. The geography of the Pacific also favors subsea drone deployment by American and allied forces. The island chains that surround China, Japan, the Philippines, Indonesia provide ideal locations for deploying and maintaining underwater surveillance networks. Chinese submarines would have to cross these monitored areas to reach open ocean, where they might have better chances of avoiding detection. For the United States and its allies, this technological shift reinforces existing geographical advantages. American and allied naval bases are distributed across multiple ocean basins and connected by secure sea lanes that are difficult for hostile submarines to interdict. Subsea drone technology makes those sea lanes even more secure by eliminating the submarine threat that has been the primary challenge to Western maritime dominance. The Atlantic and Pacific Oceans are large enough that hostile submarines could theoretically hide in remote areas and avoid detection networks. But these same oceans are controlled by navies that have the resources and technical capabilities to deploy comprehensive subsea drone surveillance systems. Russian and Chinese submarines would face the choice between operating in areas where they can be easily detected and destroyed, or hiding in remote ocean areas where they can't threaten any strategically important targets. Neither option provides useful military capabilities. The industrial implications extend beyond shipbuilding to the entire ecosystem of technologies and skills required for submarine operations. Training submarine crews, maintaining specialized equipment, and developing tactical doctrine for underwater warfare requires sustained investment and institutional continuity. If submarines become obsolete as strategic weapons, the institutional knowledge and industrial capabilities required to build and operate them will atrophy quickly. This creates a technological dead end where countries that have invested heavily in submarine capabilities find themselves with expensive assets that no longer serve any strategic purpose. The speed of this technological transition is particularly challenging for military planning and procurement. Traditional submarine development cycles take decades from initial design to operational deployment. Subsea drone technology is advancing much faster than submarine technology, which means that submarines being designed today will be operating in threat environments that are fundamentally different from current conditions. This creates impossible planning challenges for submarine-focused navies. They need to continue building and maintaining submarine capabilities for near-term operations while recognizing that those same capabilities might become strategically irrelevant within a decade. The alliance implications are also significant. NATO's integrated anti-submarine warfare capabilities have always been one of the alliance's most sophisticated and effective military functions. Subsea drone technology enhances these capabilities while creating new opportunities for burden sharing and technological cooperation among allied nations. Smaller NATO countries that can't afford to build and maintain traditional anti-submarine warfare capabilities can potentially contribute to alliance security by deploying and maintaining subsea drone networks in their territorial waters. This democratizes anti-submarine warfare in ways that strengthen alliance cohesion and effectiveness. For Russia, the loss of submarine-based strategic advantages comes at exactly the wrong time. Russian surface naval capabilities have deteriorated significantly since the Cold War, and Russian shipbuilding capacity is limited by technological sanctions and resource constraints. Submarines represented the one area where Russia could still compete with Western naval forces. The geographic isolation of Russian naval bases compounds these problems. Most Russian naval facilities are located in areas that are difficult to support logistically and vulnerable to blockade during conflicts. The Northern Fleet operates from bases that are isolated by Arctic conditions for much of the year. The Baltic Fleet operates from bases that can be easily blockaded by NATO forces. The Black Sea Fleet operates from bases that are now within range of Ukrainian weapons systems. Subsea drone technology makes all of these geographic vulnerabilities worse by eliminating the submarine escape routes that might have allowed Russian naval forces to break out of their geographic constraints during conflicts. What we're seeing is the intersection of technological innovation with geographic realities that creates strategic outcomes that are much larger than the sum of their individual parts. Subsea drones are effective because they can exploit the same geographic features that submarines have traditionally used for protection. Geographic constraints that have limited traditional anti-submarine warfare don't apply to weapon systems that operate in the same environment as their targets. The ocean's geography isn't changing, but our ability to exploit that geography for military purposes is changing rapidly. The three-dimensional opacity that made submarine warfare possible is being replaced by three-dimensional transparency that makes submarine warfare suicidal. The strategic stability implications are profound. If submarine-based nuclear deterrence becomes unreliable because of persistent tracking by subsea drone networks, nuclear-armed countries will need to rely more heavily on land-based and air-based delivery systems that have their own vulnerabilities and limitations. This could actually increase strategic instability during the transition period as countries adjust their nuclear doctrines and force structures to account for reduced submarine survivability. The temptation to use submarine-based nuclear forces before they become completely vulnerable could create dangerous incentives for preemptive action during crisis situations. For maritime commerce and international trade, the elimination of the submarine threat would represent an enormous improvement in the security and reliability of sea-based transportation. Submarine attacks on commercial shipping have been one of the most effective ways of disrupting international trade during conflicts. If submarines can no longer operate undetected in major shipping lanes, the maritime transportation system becomes much more secure and predictable. This would reduce shipping costs, eliminate the need for convoy systems during conflicts, and make international trade less vulnerable to military disruption. The long-term implications suggest that we're moving toward a world where maritime security is dominated by surface and aerial systems rather than underwater systems. This favors countries with advanced shipbuilding capabilities, sophisticated aircraft carriers, and the logistical infrastructure necessary to maintain global naval presence. That description fits the United States and its allies much better than it fits Russia or China. Both countries have invested heavily in submarine capabilities as a way of challenging Western maritime dominance without directly competing in areas where Western technological and industrial advantages are overwhelming. If those submarine investments become strategically irrelevant, Russia and China will need to compete directly with Western naval forces in areas where they have significant disadvantages. The result is likely to be an acceleration of Western maritime dominance rather than increased competition from challenger countries. The subsea drone strike on a Russian submarine isn't just a tactical success, it's a preview of how technological change interacts with geographic realities to reshape strategic relationships. The ocean's geography provided submarines with natural camouflage for over a century. That camouflage just disappeared. We're entering an era where the seafloor is as transparent as the surface, where submarines are as vulnerable as surface ships, and where maritime security depends on capabilities that favor countries with advanced industrial bases and global logistics networks. Geography still decides, but our ability to exploit geographic advantages is changing faster than the geography itself, and in this case, the changes favor the countries that already dominate maritime environments rather than the countries that were trying to challenge that dominance. The Russians just learned that the ocean is no longer a place to hide. For a navy that built its strategy around hiding, that's not a tactical problem. It's an existential crisis.